December 16th, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 300,000 American soldiers stretched across 80 miles of frozen silence, believing the war was nearly over. In the months before that morning, Allied optimism had filled Europe. Paris was free. Hitler's armies were retreating. The world thought the Third Reich was breaking apart. Soldiers wrote letters home about Christmas, about the promise of going back to wives, children, and ordinary lives. Snow covered the hills of Belgium like a white flag. Peace seemed close enough to touch, but beneath that same snow, hidden by fog and forest, a sleeping monster stirred. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, 1,600 guns. Entire armored divisions crouched behind the pines, their engines buried in frost, waiting for one moment to shatter the silence and burn the snow. It was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate strike through the Ardennes to split the Allied armies in half, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on his terms. Most German commanders doubted it could succeed. Fuel was scarce, soldiers were exhausted, and the skies, once ruled by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to Allied planes. But winter brought something even Hitler could use: cover. Thick clouds grounded Allied bombers. Endless snow muffled engines and tracks. The very weather that froze the men in their foxholes also hid the greatest ambush of the war. The Americans stationed in this sector were not elite units. They were weary, undersupplied, and scattered thin. Many were new recruits who had never fired a shot in anger. To them, the Ardennes was a quiet post, a place to rest, to recover, to wait out the cold. On the German side, men whispered prayers under their breath as they waited in the dark. Tank crews huddled inside frozen hulls, wrapping themselves in blankets to keep the oil from turning solid. In some places, entire battalions stood motionless for hours, forbidden to smoke or speak. The frost clung to their rifles. Breath fogged their helmets. Still, they waited. As midnight passed, orders moved quietly from trench to trench. Prepare to move. Hold for the signal. When it came, the world would change. In the American lines, a few veterans noticed things that didn't feel right. A dog barking at something unseen in the trees. The way the wind carried the faint metallic scent of engines. But when they mentioned it, no one wanted to listen. It was nearly Christmas. Commanders believed the enemy was broken, that only scattered German resistance remained. By 4 a.m., a pale grey light began to creep through the fog. Somewhere in the woods, a German officer raised a flare gun. The light climbed through the mist like a ghost, then burst into a single white flower of fire. The forest held its breath. A heartbeat later, 1,600 German guns opened up in unison. The silence shattered. Shells screamed through the air, tearing into American lines. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow turned black with smoke and blood. Roads vanished beneath craters. In minutes, entire regiments were cut off from the world. Radios died. Telephone wires burned. Men stumbled out of bunkers into a nightmare of thunder and flame. Across 80 miles, the Ardennes erupted into chaos. Columns of German tanks roared forward from the mist, their engines howling through the smoke. Infantry followed close behind, shouting through the noise, bayonets glinting in the white light of dawn. For the Americans, it felt like the earth itself had betrayed them, as if the forest they trusted had turned against them. Somewhere along the line, an officer screamed into a broken radio, "We're under attack, all along the front," but no one heard him. By the time the sun rose over Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge had begun. The first shells landed before dawn. At first they sounded distant, like thunder rolling through mountains, but within seconds the air itself began to shake. Trees split apart. Snow and earth erupted together in a blinding white-black storm. American soldiers who had been half asleep in their foxholes were thrown against frozen walls of mud. In that instant, every illusion of peace was gone. Across 80 miles of front, 1,600 German guns fired as one. Artillery positions that had been silent for weeks now spewed flame. Towns like Monschau, Saint-Vith and Bastogne disappeared beneath a storm of shrapnel. Telephone wires snapped, roads vanished. The few radios that still worked crackled with confusion. Fragmented reports, broken signals, men shouting over static. Nobody knew where the line ended or began. Then came the armor. From the mist rolled the black silhouettes of panthers and tigers, their engines rumbling like beasts awakened from hibernation. Infantry followed close behind, white camouflage blending with snow, advancing between shattered pines. Each squad moved with mechanical precision, an army reborn from the ruins of defeat. At first, the Americans thought it was a local counterattack, but as the hours passed, the scale became clear. This was an entire army pushing west, and they were everywhere. In the small Belgian town of Losheimergraben, men of the 99th Infantry Division fought to hold crossroads buried in snow. They had no idea that 10 German divisions were converging on their position. Ammunition crates froze shut, rifle bolts jammed from ice. Still, they fired into the fog until their barrels steamed. By noon, the forest was alive with chaos. Convoys burned on the roads, columns of smoke twisting through the treetops. German tanks crushed snowdrifts that hid the dead. Prisoners were marched back east, their hands raised, disbelief etched on their faces. No one could understand how so many enemy troops had appeared from nowhere. Far behind the lines, headquarters still refused to believe it. Reports were dismissed as exaggerations. Commanders insisted the Germans didn't have the strength, but every hour the truth grew louder until the ground itself seemed to scream it. In the village of Lanzerath, a single American reconnaissance platoon of 18 men held off nearly 500 German paratroopers for most of the day. They fought from foxholes carved in ice, their machine guns freezing between bursts. When they finally surrendered, they had delayed an entire regiment, a handful of soldiers against a tide. Elsewhere, retreat turned to rout. Truck convoys clogged the roads, snow hiding landmines beneath their tires. Paratroopers dropped behind Allied lines wearing stolen American uniforms, spreading confusion, changing road signs and whispering false orders. Panic spread faster than the enemy. By nightfall, the once silent Ardennes had become a storm of fire and fear. The Germans called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, but the Americans who survived that day would call it something else, the Bulge. That night, under red skies and falling snow, hundreds of thousands of men on both sides tried to make sense of what had begun. The front no longer existed. The map was meaningless. Everywhere, roads ended in fire, and in the middle of it, cut off, outnumbered and surrounded, stood 300,000 American soldiers trapped inside Hitler's deadly winter gamble. By the third day, the front no longer existed. Roads once marked on Allied maps vanished under snow and fire. Entire regiments moved without orders, retreating toward towns whose names they could barely pronounce. Radios were dead, skies too thick for planes. The Ardennes had become a maze, every tree hiding danger, every road a guess. The German advance cut through the American line like a blade through cloth. Columns of panzers rolled through the fog toward the Meuse River, splitting units apart, isolating pockets of resistance. Those caught inside didn't yet realize they were surrounded. They still fought as if help were coming. In Bastogne, a small crossroads town in southern Belgium, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne arrived to hold the line. Most were exhausted from previous battles, still without winter gear. They dug foxholes in frozen ground with bare hands, breath freezing on rifles. The town was quiet, too quiet. Locals spoke in whispers, knowing the storm was closing in. Farther north, at Saint-Vith, the 7th Armoured Division resisted wave after wave of attacks, their tanks fighting until the barrels glowed red. For every mile gained by the Germans, blood marked the snow. On the morning of December 20th, the trap closed. German units converged around Bastogne and Saint-Vith, forming a steel ring that cut off nearly 300,000 Americans from the rest of the Allied force. Ammunition dwindled, medical stations overflowed, cold killed as efficiently as bullets, and still they held. Men shared rations the size of coins, burned rifle crates for warmth, and used bandages already frozen stiff with blood. The only promise was that the enemy was everywhere, and that retreat meant death. When night fell, the horizon flickered with artillery fire, the edges of the trap glowing like the rim of a volcano. Inside that circle, surrounded, the Americans dug deeper. By the final week of December 1944, the small Belgian town of Bastogne stood at the center of Hitler's winter gamble. Every road through the Ardennes led there, and whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of armies across the region. To the German High Command, it was a vital crossroads. To the surrounded Americans, it became a symbol of defiance. Inside the town, roughly 11,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division, joined by scattered armor and artillery units, were encircled on all sides. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow fell without pause, piling in drifts over foxholes and gun pits. The men lacked winter coats, gloves, even proper boots. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. Still, they dug in. Bastogne itself was a ruin. The marketplace was cratered, its church shattered by shells. Civilians huddled in basements beside wounded paratroopers, the air heavy with smoke and fear. Yet the Americans refused to yield. Every approach road bristled with machine guns, bazookas, and makeshift barricades of wrecked vehicles. Supply lines were cut, fuel almost gone, but morale somehow held. German attacks came daily. Tanks advanced through fog while artillery pounded the town from every direction. The defenders answered shot for shot. When ammunition ran low, gunners fired single shells at targets of opportunity. Field medics worked by candlelight, amputating limbs frozen beyond repair. In the command post under the seminary building, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe scrawled his reports on scraps of paper because typewriters froze solid. On December 22nd, German envoys arrived under a white flag. They delivered a neatly typed ultimatum: surrender or face total annihilation. McAuliffe glanced at the message, shook his head, and handed back a single word: nuts. The reply was translated with some difficulty, but its meaning was unmistakable. That afternoon, German artillery resumed with double fury. The siege tightened. Shells fell like rain, houses collapsed into fire, yet every man who could still hold a rifle fought. Engineers turned wrecked jeeps into roadblocks. Airborne troopers scavenged ammunition from the dead. Each night, the forest flickered red from tracer fire, and each dawn revealed another ring of bodies stiff in the snow. At the edge of the perimeter, along the Neuchâteau Road, Captain Charles P. Shea's company of the 327th Glider Infantry held a farmhouse that controlled the southern approach. For 3 days, the Germans attacked in waves. The walls of the farmhouse disintegrated under shell fire. The roof collapsed. Still, the Americans held the doorway until none could stand. When the last survivors were pulled out, the snow inside was stained dark with blood and soot. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne seemed doomed. Ammunition was down to a handful of rounds per gun. The wounded lay stacked in corridors, moaning through morphine haze. Outside, German loudspeakers blared Christmas carols, followed by promises of mercy if the town surrendered. The paratroopers answered by singing louder. That night, the sky cleared for the first time in a week. A dull hum grew to a roar. Allied transport planes, flares marked the drop zones, and parachutes bloomed like flowers against the moonlight. Crates of food, ammunition, medical supplies. Men cheered and wept at the sight. It was proof that the outside world hadn't forgotten them. Bastogne would not fall, but around it the wider battle still raged, and for those trapped elsewhere, salvation was days away. While Bastogne fought for its life, General George S. Patton was already on the move. In a feat that stunned friend and foe alike, his Third Army executed a 90-degree turn through snow-choked roads to relieve the surrounded troops. Nearly 250,000 men, 400 tanks, and 1,400 artillery pieces shifted direction in under 48 hours, a maneuver few armies in history have matched. The march north was brutal. Icy winds froze engines, bridges collapsed under the weight of armor. Drivers chained wheels for traction, and infantry marched beside their vehicles, guiding them through darkness. Every village along the way bore scars, burned churches, overturned wagons, refugees moving in silence. Patton pushed them on with one order: keep going. At dawn on December 26th, the lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion approached the southern outskirts of Bastogne. Ahead lay the German roadblocks of Ardennes, woods, mines, and anti-tank guns. The column opened fire. For an hour, the forest shook with explosions. Then, through drifting smoke, an American paratrooper appeared on the road, rifle raised in salute. "Glad to see you, boys," he said. The siege had been broken. Across the Ardennes, similar clashes unfolded. At St. Vith, the 7th Armoured Division delayed the German advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. To the north, British forces under Montgomery prepared counterattacks to contain the Bulge. Yet the Germans still held large pockets, their tanks fanning west towards the Meuse River. The outcome remained uncertain. Then the weather changed. On December 29th, the skies cleared, blue and merciless. Allied air power returned with a vengeance. Hundreds of Thunderbolts, Mustangs and Typhoons swept the roads, strafing convoys, torching fuel trucks, scattering columns of men. German supply lines disintegrated under the assault. For the first time since the offensive began, the initiative shifted. Inside the collapsing front, German soldiers suffered as the Americans once had, cut off, starving, freezing. Captured diaries spoke of despair. No fuel, no food, no hope. Hitler's grand gamble, meant to split the Allies, was crumbling in the snow. Patton pressed north relentlessly. His armor met fierce resistance at every village, Marvy, Loutrebois, Cibray, but each fell in turn. By early January 1945, the ring around Bastogne expanded outward. Convoys poured in, bringing supplies, medics, replacements. The once besieged town became the spearhead of the counter-offensive. Meanwhile, along the northern shoulder, US First Army and British units launched attacks from the other side of the Bulge. Artillery thundered from dawn till dusk. Towns like Houffalize and La Roche were reduced to rubble. Step by step, the Allies squeezed the pocket shut. On January 16th, the two prongs, Patton from the south and Hodges from the north, met near Houffalize. The Bulge was gone. What had begun a month earlier as Hitler's last desperate surge had ended in retreat and ruin. When Patton inspected Bastogne afterward, he removed his gloves, saluted the paratroopers, and said simply, "You held." Few victories of the war would cost so much, or mean so much. The Ardennes lay silent once more, but the silence was different now, heavier, haunted. The snow concealed a battlefield that stretched for miles, scattered with wrecked armor, frozen bodies, and shattered villages. In places, the smell of cordite lingered long after the smoke cleared. Official reports would list more than 89,000 American casualties, over 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. British losses added several thousand more. German records, fragmentary and confused, estimated around 100,000 casualties, irrecoverable for an army already bleeding from every front. Civilians across Belgium and Luxembourg paid their own price. Entire towns erased, thousands left homeless in the dead of winter. For the Allies, the battle marked both a tragedy and a triumph. The German offensive had failed to reach the Meuse. Antwerp remained safe. Yet the cost shocked even hardened veterans. The war's end was in sight, but victory no longer felt glorious. It felt inevitable, exhausting, and cold. In the months that followed, historians would call it Hitler's last gamble, the moment when the Third Reich exhausted its final reserves of manpower and faith. After the Bulge, Germany's defeat became only a matter of time, but for the men who fought there, the memories never left. Survivors spoke of snow that never melted in their dreams, of friends frozen where they fell, of foxholes that became graves overnight. They remembered the sound of shells tearing the air, the sudden hush after an explosion, and the way silence returned, not peace, but absence. When spring arrived and the snow receded, locals uncovered the truth beneath. Fields, once white, were now brown with mud and iron. Farmers found helmets, canteens, letters never sent. In Bastogne, children played beside tanks rusting into the earth. The forest grew back, but its roots tangled around relics of war. The US Army built cemeteries across Belgium and Luxembourg, rows upon rows of white crosses. Each one bore a name, or sometimes just the word unknown. Pilgrims would come for generations to stand among them, reading silently, listening to the wind that still carried echoes of artillery. For Germany, the defeat sealed its fate. The Western Front collapsed within months. The Allies crossed to the Rhine in March. Berlin would fall before the next spring thaw. Yet amid that wider story, the Bulge remained a singular event, a frozen moment where courage met despair. Historians later debated strategy, leadership, timing, but none could quantify the human endurance displayed in that winter. Against overwhelming odds, surrounded and freezing, the American soldier had refused to yield. That refusal changed the war. Today, the Ardennes is quiet again. Villages rebuilt, roads paved, forests thick with new pines. Only the memorials mark what happened. The Mardassen monument in Bastogne, the simple plaques along country lanes, the rusted tank left where it died. Beneath them, the ground still holds metal and bone, a reminder of the price of freedom. 300,000 Americans had entered the storm. Many never came home, but their stand in the snow broke the last dream of the Third Reich, and in doing so, they ensured that Europe would awaken one final time to peace.